I got the privilege of talking to a longtime friend of mine and colleague, Jigar Shah, and Jigar has just published a new book, Creating Climate Wealth, and he adds that to his long resume of many accomplishments that he has so far achieved in his young life. Jigar, welcome to EV World again.
Thanks, my friend.
Okay, great. Looks like we've got a little bit of a time delay here, so hopefully we can make all this work. Well, look, we want to talk about Creating Climate Wealth, which is the new book that you've published. What I'm interested though in is let's get a question out of the way that I've been dying to ask for many years now. You worked as the director of the Carbon War Room for a period of time. You worked directly with Richard Branson, who is probably the preeminent serial entrepreneur in the world. What's it like? What is he like, and what's it like working for a guy with that kind of energy?
Well, it's certainly not easy with a guy with that much energy, but he really is an extraordinary guy, and he really does have a heart of gold, just like he looks. He really cares deeply about these social issues like climate change, as well as the environment and poverty and other things, while at the same time believing that entrepreneurship and capitalism are some of the best ways to solve it.
Okay, which is sort of contrary to what we normally think, because if we tend to think of capitalism as being kind of the, pardon the expression, but the rape and pillage approach to commerce, or at least it can be that way, and certainly has had manifestations of that. So how do we take the power, the energy of capitalism, and channel it in a way that is used in a constructive manner rather than the destructive manner we often see it wielded in?
Well, I think that, for many of us who have followed capitalism closely, it's really about getting to a more democratized version of it. When you think about some of the large utility companies that serve our country, or some of the large oil and coal companies, they really are running virtual monopolies. I mean, in the utility case, they are monopolies.
Yeah.
But in the coal companies' cases, they've actually secured so much land and so many rights and have their own rail infrastructure, et cetera, that it's almost impossible to compete with them. And so it's in that vein that people actually go bad, right? It's AT&T before us in the telephone business, or whether it's the AT&T equivalents today. And so I think what you see in the climate change movement is a set of companies who are really selling infrastructure $1 million at a time, not $1 billion at a time.
Yeah,
right. So when you're putting solar on rooftops, or fleets of electric vehicles in people's parking lots, or low carbon technologies into farming and agriculture, you're selling customers $1 million at a time. And that, to me, is really a democratization of capitalism.
Okay. Well, let's before the Carbon War Room, and we're going to talk a little bit about, I think, each of these. Before SunEdison, which you founded, you held a number of different jobs in your life. Some fairly menial, and some fairly prestigious. So how did those experiences that you had sort of lead to the creation of Creating Climate Wealth?
Well, it's a great question. I grew up in a very small town in rural Illinois, and when you grow up in a small town, as you know, people really substitute capital with labor. People do the work themselves. They mow their own lawn. They do all those things because they don't necessarily have the abilities to just go out and pay everybody $300 a week to do the work for them.
Yeah.
And so that's really where I grew up. And my dad, was a medical doctor, is still a medical doctor, and started many practices. And so when he actually started his practice in Tampico, Illinois, and Rock Falls, Illinois, these are entrepreneurial experiences that we went through, and as a child I remember watching, money was really tight and figuring out cash coming in and cash going out, and
Yeah.
do you really invest in that new machine, or do you actually pay for Jigar to go to a summer camp? So they're real trade-offs, and so I learned about those types of sacrifices that you make around entrepreneurship at an early age. And then I went to a fantastic engineering school at the University of Illinois, and when a lot of my friends were going to work for Detroit and going to work for the large auto companies, because that's what you do when you go to a Big Ten engineering school, I really wanted to work in renewables. And I remember, no renewable energy companies came to college for the job fair, and so I had to actually get my brother and myself went into did a big West Coast tour. We drove over 1,500 miles, where I went from company to company asking for a job. And those are the kinds of things you have to do, I think, when you really want to make it into an emerging industry.
Yep. Well, let's talk about the creating climate wealth, because that obviously then is sort of the foundation for what you got into this. So what's the premise of the book?
Well, I think the premise of the book is that when you think about the analysis that has been done globally, whether it be by the International Energy Agency, McKinsey, the Carbon War Room, everyone comes out at roughly the same number, which is that somewhere approximating 50% of all climate emissions, carbon emissions, can be profitably offset with technologies that we invented in the 1970s and since then. And so we can profitably stave off the worst impacts of climate change if we only knew how to deploy these cost-effective, profitable technologies. And so, what I surmise, and the thesis behind the book, is that it's really not a technological innovation problem. It's a business model innovation problem. We don't know how to deploy technologies that already work. It's not that the technologies that already work have to be made better.
So how do we do that? I mean, what are sort of the steps that you see us taking that would address this? Because obviously what we see is we've got a current system. It's like the Titanic in many respects. It's a great big unwieldy thing that's moving with it seems with full speed ahead into this unknown that the guys down in the navigation room are saying, we think there are problems out there. Maybe we ought to slow down. And maybe shift course and things like that. So we've got this monolith that's moving along. Where do you see us changing that? Obviously, if the technology's there, what's the hang up? What's the bottleneck? And how do we solve it?
Well, so the way in which the book lays this out is through my experiences at SunEdison, because I think that both your experiences in the electric vehicle business and my experience in solar are similar in the sense that people can talk a good game and write great government reports, but ultimately it's somebody on the ground that actually has to make the decisions to get something out into the marketplace.
Right.
And so I do think there are this big iceberg there, and unfortunately these icebergs are real because they're breaking off the Arctic shelf these days because of climate change.
Yeah.
And
more than metaphorical.
Exactly. And when you look at solar power, the cost of solar energy really came down precipitously in 2003 when I started SunEdison. And I think that was the last time that we hit a low point in solar before prices went back up because of silicon shortages and then came back down again because of technology innovation. But when you look at why solar really got deployed, it was really business model innovation since 2003, not technology innovation. The technology innovation helped for sure and had a big role to play in getting costs down. But this no money down solar technique that we popularized at SunEdison using the power purchase agreement, and also a lot of the banking reforms that the Germans did in getting loans into solar, is really what made it easier and more profitable for people to say, okay, great, I'm going to put this on my roof. And you can see how the lessons that we learned in solar can be translated into local food and hydroponic greenhouses, for instance, with produce purchase agreements that Bright Farms is, signing,
Yeah.
or heat heat agreements, which solar hot water heating companies can do, or demand savings agreements, which STEM is doing with a battery storage technology in California. So you could see how the lessons we learn in solar and bringing mainstream capital into our business could be transferred to the other 17 or 16 sectors in climate change, but they're not happening. They're not getting transferred. And so the reason I wrote the book was really to get people to think about how we take those lessons that we've perfected and learned in solar and bring them to electric vehicles and local food and water and waste.
Yep. Who needs to read this book? Who did you write it for? Is it entrepreneurs, government officials? Who's your audience?
Well, honestly, the first draft of the book was written for myself, just getting all of these thoughts out of my head and onto a piece of paper. And so as an entrepreneur myself, I would say that the first audience that has read it, because we've already sold about 1,500 copies of this thing in the first week, and who's responded well to it are entrepreneurs. I think there's another group of people that I talk about in the book, which are impact investors. And I have a very sort of strong point of view that impact investors, when they teach entrepreneurs the wrong lessons by giving them below market interest rates and all that stuff, are actually corrupting those entrepreneurs. And I've gotten mixed reviews from them, obviously. Some of them think I'm full of crap, and other folks think that that I'm right. The thesis I have there is that basically you don't attract someone like Goldman Sachs without achieving financially compelling rates of return. They just don't follow the Rockefeller Foundation after the Rockefeller Foundation has provided somebody with 3% interest money to do affordable housing energy efficiency. Goldman Sachs doesn't say, oh yeah, let me give you a lot more money at 4%.
Yeah, right.
And these entrepreneurs don't understand that because they found it so easy to get that 3% money from the impact investors in the first place.
Yeah.
And then the last audience, well, not the last audience, but another audience is government officials. There are many government officials who have been thinking and praying about how we get energy efficiency to move into the building sector and EVs out into the world. As you know, we all lived through the 1998 zero emission vehicle mandate in California.
Yep.
And how do we actually, create policy that encourages this business model innovation and acknowledges that the business model innovation has to exist, as opposed to where I think most politicians are today, where they just think that, well, if a technology doesn't self-replicate into the marketplace, then the technology is just not ready, and we need more R&D.
Right. So you've got sort of two poles here. You've got the pole that says everything has to be done with incentives and tax breaks and credits. And then you got the other pole that says let the market forces dictate, and if market forces aren't, show that EVs aren't ready or solar isn't ready or whatever, then then it's just not ready. And so what you're saying, I guess, is that there's kind of the policymakers need to adjust policy to basically encourage this sort of thinking differently, rather than always going to government and saying, can I have a handout, please, to make my technology work? Let's think about how we adapt policy so that the market forces are in place to make it work. Am I sort of on the right track here?
Sure, and I'll give you a great example. So in the electric vehicle world, we lived through the zero emission vehicle mandate, where there was just a mandate on having electric vehicles.
Right.
And we also lived through the point where, during the stimulus bill, the Obama administration gave out over $100 million of capital to A123 batteries and a bunch of other folks to say, oh, we want to build batteries here in the U.S. and we want the cost to go down. And I think both of those policies turned out to be pretty bad policy. And in fact, the better policy was what we're doing now, which is this electric vehicle credits, for instance, right? Tesla is getting 14% of their total revenues coming from selling their electric vehicle credits to other automakers. To other
companies, yeah.
Right? And that money is being used to help drive their business forward, and in a very flexible way, in the same way that the Leaf is doing the same thing. Nissan has assembled so many credits on the electric vehicle side that they're having to sell their credits too now. And these days a Leaf is actually, I think, the cheapest car you can get. It's $99 a month in some of these leases.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the other policy that the federal government employed is on the tax credit on the federal side, and said, actually, if this game is about scale, which it is, then after you've sold your first 200,000 vehicles, you no longer need the credit, right? So every automaker gets 200,000 vehicles, they can get the credit, and once they've hit that threshold, then presumably your fixed costs have been paid off around the designing of the vehicle and the batteries and testing and all that stuff. And so I think that's good policy. It basically says, look, your industry needs to get to scale. We're going to help you get to scale. And once you get to scale, we're going to get out of the way and let the free market work.